Hi, this is Vikas. It's Thursday morning in London, and one of the things I'm always struck about in the education sector is how committed and dedicated we are to what happens in schools. But there's also, as we now know, a wider world out there that has an impact on education. And so, what I wanted to start using these live streams for was to speak to people who are not necessarily teachers or educators, but obviously engage in education in some form or another, but actually have a wider perspective. So today, I'm really delighted to introduce two of my friends, Rain Newton-Smith, who is the chief economist of the Confederation of British Industry, and Lutfey Siddiqi, who's a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, who today is in Singapore. Rain and Lutfey, welcome to this live stream.
Thank you.
Hello.
Great to be here.
And so, you heard me talk about the pandemic and how much of an effect it's had on the education sector. But more broadly, I'd love a perspective from you, Rain, in terms of what has been the impact on global economy in particular as a result of what we have seen. And obviously, we can see for ourselves in terms of the way that we are in lockdown, we're not consuming stuff, we're not necessarily going to work. Just give us some broad kind of contours as to what's been happening, and then I'll ask a set of questions as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, Vikas, it's been an incredible year. I think what's been really unprecedented has just been the scale of what we've seen and just the number of countries that have been impacted. And of course, what started as a global health pandemic, and everyone's priority has been about, protecting the health of their people, their nations, supporting their health services. Very soon became, also as well, how do we protect the health of our economies? Because, at one stage we had over 70% of the world economy in some kind of lockdown. So, and that's meant, we've seen unprecedented drops in GDP and output, and obviously a lot of that was by design. And I think it's triggered so many things. I mean, a big debate about, do we put health first or the economy first? And I think that's actually been a really false debate, because what we've seen is the countries that have tackled the pandemic well, their economies have been much more resilient. And it's really about how, we need to tackle that together. But I think, in my role, I speak to businesses in the UK across all different sectors, all different sizes. And I think that what they've sort of said is, I mean, it's been amazing on the one hand, the resilience we've seen in the economy and in businesses. And we've almost seen like a decade of change in the course of a few months, where you had businesses who overnight went to doing their entire staff working from home. And I know in education, the education system absolutely had to do some of that transformation as well. And I think it's the resilience that really sticks out for me. And that digital adoption is a trend that was out there already, but it's been hugely accelerated across all kinds of business. We've seen a big acceleration in how people in consumer spending habit, people are much more comfortable buying things online. That was a trend that was happening already, but you almost had, the same amount of change you'd had in the previous decade accelerated over the course of the lockdown. So I think there are some real fundamental changes in the economy that have been going on, during this pandemic. And of course, it's really helped people, reassess their lives, reassess the importance of their local communities, of the natural environment. I think so much of that has also been going on. And I guess, particularly in this context, something that we pushed for very hard at the beginning was just that we really need to focus on the enablers of the economy. And the two that really have stood out is education and our transport and sort of wider infrastructures. And we pushed very hard, once schools were ready, to get schools open again, because it has such an impact, on their kids, but also on working parents, but importantly on social mobility. We know that, the kids being able to be in school, to be able to learn, particularly important from households on lower incomes where they don't have the same facilities at home. So I think education as an enabler, I think economists always knew about it, but I think people now really understand the vital role that teachers play.
Thank you so much, Rain. And Lutfey, do you have a perspective on this?
Yes, I do. I think what the pandemic has done, the tragic pandemic has done, is accelerate many of the trends that were already in play. And if you just zoom out for a little bit, December 2019, it was 2019, all of the last year, was the weakest growth for the globe since the global financial crisis. And we weren't exactly fighting fit going into this. And now you have, through a mixture of the effect of the virus and also the lockdown, which is effectively an induced coma for the economy, a shrinkage to the economy of some 10, 11% in the case of the UK, about 4.5% for the world as a whole. So we're shrinking and then returning at about half the pace into next year. So the UK will take 4 or 5 years before it gets back to the level of GDP that we had in December of last year. And that is an enormous shock to the system that I don't think people fully appreciate. But also, as I say, it's an accelerant of trends that we had seen before. It's that fourth industrial revolution that we've spoken about for so long. And there's a book that I would recommend, since your viewers are teachers. It's a book that came out in the middle of this year. It's called Radical Uncertainty. And I really recommend it because it brings into focus how we are now in a world of uncertainty versus a world of risk. And within that, I would argue that education is both the most disrupted sector and also the most invested sectors. It's just a matter of what type of education. And there's 3 parts to that, the fourth industrial revolution that impacts this world. In the 6 or 7 years when you and I have known each other, Vikas, we've had 2 waves of disruption to jobs. The first one was the radiologist was empowered. You could transfer large files as attachment on emails. And so the x-rays could be sent to the doctor somewhere in the Philippines or Bangladesh, and they could read it, give a diagnosis, and earn income from anywhere in the world. In the second wave, AI has taken over. Machine learning can do diagnosis better than any human. So suddenly that same radiologist has now been disempowered. And we've seen these 2 waves happen in this short period. For the education sector, someone very cruelly told me the other day that you guys are going through the gramophone moment. So in 1887, when the gramophone was invented, until then, you could be a mediocre musician playing in your own locality, and people thought you were quite good, you had an income. Now, the best of the best are online. So if you're not there, expectations have been set to such a level. If you're mediocre, you probably wouldn't have a job. Influencers, Kylie Jenner and Cristiano Ronaldo, they get $1 million for each post on Instagram. And to some extent, teachers have to compete for attention over there. And the last one I'd mention is ExxonMobil was the largest company in the league table of stock markets when you and I met for the first time. It's no longer in the top 10. Zoom is bigger than ExxonMobil, which is an incredible state to be in. And the top 7 or 8 companies in the world are all platform companies. You've got to go to the 8th or 9th before you get to a real company. So I think the scale of change is something that really needs to be appreciated for teachers to now then think about their own jobs and also how they are training people or educating people for the future.
So that comes to this question, Rain, I suppose, and Lutfey has kind of introduced us to the topic, and I wanted to pick your brains on. He talked about the pandemic being an accelerant, and you inferred that as well. But what changes do you think are here to stay in the way we operate as consumer societies? And I say this with trying to help my friends who are teachers understand that the broad kind of behaviors that we think are going to take root coming out of this pandemic, so that we can think about what the impacts are on the school or on that community hub, as it were.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many there, and I think it's almost become a bit of a cliche, but the move to online is absolutely with us to stay. I mean, I think to put some numbers around it, people's share of the amount of spending that they do online went from about 20%, so 1/5 of our overall spend in the UK, to over 1/3 just in the course of those few months in Q2 back in the spring here in the UK. It's come down a little bit, but that in some sense was an acceleration of the trend we'd already seen on the previous decade. It went from about 1/10 of our spending to to 1/5. So that acceleration will absolutely continue. So I think we know that move to buying online, and businesses as well, much more of using technological adoption. Over 60% of businesses adopted some form of technology they hadn't used before. So this adoption of digital technologies to deliver content is absolutely with us, and that's transforming the world of education. I think the one big trend and thing we really need to think about that was here before we went into the pandemic, but I think the big challenge in the UK, and it will be true for many countries in the short term, will be rising unemployment, and how do we help people back into the labour market. And what people are really worried about is scarring. So young people coming into if you're coming into a labor market that already has high unemployment, you're leaving the world of, your school, university, and coming into the labor market when there's high unemployment, the scars of that stay with you for a very long time. There's lots of studies that have shown that throughout the course of economic history. So you have lower earnings throughout your lifetime because you basically come in at a really challenging time. So how we help those young people back into work is so important, particularly, for example, in the UK, a lot of places where we'll see job losses are often the sectors where people have their first entry into the labour market, working in a bar, a pub, a cafe, a local shop, a retail, sports, live events. And so how we help people gain work experience will be really important. And I think if you layer onto that the technological change that Lutfey was talking about, and also the fact we have an aging population. We know that we've done studies in the UK that show, over 90% of the population will need some form of retraining over the next decade. And actually, there's probably 1/6 of people who really need some fundamental, need to move sectors, need to really move jobs. But yet our education systems are really geared up to really focusing on that investment in education when people are young. But in some sense, that model really needs to change because we're all living and working longer. And many of us will need some pretty radical retraining, upskilling throughout our working lives. And I think that's something that as a society, we're only just starting to grapple. And you put some of this scarring effects from the pandemic into that. And I think it's really challenging. And I think the other thing that I find really striking is what it means for social mobility. So one of the stats that really sticks with me is over half of working adults in the UK, from the bottom 1/5 of the income distribution, so the 20% who are sort of from poorer backgrounds, 50% of them have had no training since they left high school, right? And so that means two things. One, it just shows how important it is to get that teaching at the early years so right, because that is the skills which people will carry throughout their lifetime. And secondly, we do need to think about how we make it easier for working adults to get back into training, education, and just rethinking their lives and keeping that learning throughout our working lives.
Given that teaching is a public sector job, you talked about the impact on jobs. What are you seeing in the public sector in particular, Rain?
Yeah, so I think what's been amazing is the digital adoption is absolutely happening in the technology sector and in the public sector, right? So I engage with government all the time, and suddenly we're doing that all virtually on Microsoft Teams, and of course other platforms are available, but suddenly we're really engaging so quickly and easily with people, and you can see that as well with what's happened in the science community, right? We've seen geneticists, epidemiologists out there on using TikTok to explain their work to a wider public audience. I mean, I think that stuff has been incredible. The access to science that we've seen in this pandemic, I think, has been phenomenal. And the learning that scientists have had from around the world about how to treat the pandemic, people who've been infected, how to handle the pandemic, I think is hugely positive. So I think the innovation has absolutely been happening in the public sector, and we've seen it in the education sector. We've seen, my kids' school were able to pivot to teaching, to doing all that teaching online. I mean, I think people miss the face-to-face interaction, but how do we harness the best of the online learning with the power of face-to-face interaction and teacher-led creativity? I think is if we can find that sweet spot, there's so much we can do together.
Lutfey, if I was a teacher and given the pandemic, should I be worried about my job?
Yes, I think we should all be worried, but there's a way to harness that by thinking about the opportunities that are out there. I think every job will be disrupted. I would even say we should retire the word teacher. I think it covers only a small part of what the job entails. You're a coach, you're a facilitator, you're a concierge, you're an explainer, interlocutor, nurturer, clearinghouse of conflict, a convener of all of that. So I think unless influencer, like Kylie Jenner and Ronaldo, unless we really think of our job in the totality of what's required in this day and age, I think, and it's a fact that some teachers of the past will not be fit for the job of the future, as it's the case in everything else. And we all need to learn how to migrate. Our friend Marcela Escobar of the Brookings Institute came up with a wonderful study that shows the professions where there is stickiness and those in which people are able to migrate easily. And unfortunately, we have a double whammy right now in that the jobs that have been affected by COVID are the ones that historically have had very little ability to transition to another role. And that's why I think now, if I take an international perspective and think about UK versus some of the countries in Asia, for example, I see there are two camps. You've got those who are in the bounce back category. So the language is, bounce back loan and so on. You've got those in the bouncing forward category. So Singapore has a very explicit futuring approach. They don't believe we're ever going to return to December 2019. And so they're positioning themselves for that future. How do we digitize the shipping industry so that there's interoperability between the Chinese system and the US system, and how can Singapore be in that? And the other difference is the camp of those who are stuck in the old political binary between left and right, the capitalist and the socialist approach, versus those who have risen above the binary. Skills training is a classic example. Should it not be a public good, continuous skills training at a time of radical uncertainty and radical change? I did a very unscientific experiment. I went to the website of one of the London universities and one of the universities here in Singapore, roughly the same course, summer course. They cost £2,000 each. You go to FAQ and you go, can I get financial assistance? The one in London says, speak to your employer. You go to the one in Singapore and it says, if you're a Singaporean, you pay a third of the fees. If you're a Singaporean above the age of 40, you pay a sixth of the fees. And even if you're below the age of 40, if you're employed by an SME and they want to pay for you for this, then they only pay a sixth of the cost. So that is an explicit acknowledgement that market forces cannot adjust quickly enough in this situation. There's no need to get bogged down about, but that is left-wing and that's right-wing and socialist and all of that. So I think we really need policymakers to rise above that false binary.
And so when I think about little Johnny in my classroom, and Johnny puts his hand up and says, "Sir, what do you think I should do when I leave school or university?" What would your response be, Rain, in terms of what kind of careers, what kind of jobs, what kind of degrees that little Johnny should actually prioritize, given that he's having to cut a check from his dad or mom's pocket, right? In terms of to undertake further education. Do you have a response to that?
Well, look, I think it's, people always sort of talk in sort of frightening terms that the robots are going to take our jobs, right? And I think the way to think about it is this changing world of technology isn't, I mean, there are some jobs that we will see less of in the future, but really it's changing the skills with which we do so many different jobs. It's changing the nature of work rather, and generally this, technology will create more opportunities over the medium term. It's trying to help people adjust to that. And I guess what I would say, I mean, it's the obvious things: do what you're passionate about, but gain skills that are really transferable. So absolutely embrace the digital world and ground yourself in its true, proper skills around maths, problem solving, right, is so important. And STEM is always going to be important, I think, married with creativity. And I think actually the best way to sort of think about it is almost the things that make us uniquely human are going to become more and more valuable in the future. So creativity, innovation, ideas, empathy, emotional intelligence, it's all, because if you think about like the doctor and that radiologist that Lutfey was thinking about, is in a way they've been freed because they can use digital technology to almost compare those x-rays. So what can they do? They can spend more time with that patient and saying, how are you feeling? What other symptoms are you having? What's your lifestyle like? And suddenly you have a much more sort of holistic and time to really have that approach, which we know from the science leads to much better outcomes. So I think it is absolutely about problem solving, understanding the world, the digital technologies that are out there, and using that to enable your opportunities. The other thing I would say that we haven't talked about yet, but is absolutely out there, and is thinking about the world of climate change and how economies and countries are pivoting to tackling climate change and trying to reduce our carbon emissions, right? That transformation is just starting, and it is huge and fundamental. In the UK, we now have a net zero target. The amount of investment we need to see in low carbon technologies over the next decade is phenomenal. And there's a whole, that will bring with it rethinking how we design our cities, our homes, our buildings, to really have sustainability at the heart of it. And so I think that's a huge area, that our young people are so passionate about it, and there's a whole set of skills that we need to deliver that transformation.
Rain, just a question on that, because I do get asked this, and of course everyone is aware of climate change and that kind of thing, but how will it actually physically come to impact schools as institutions?
Well, I mean, there's one, and this is maybe a more UK-centric thing, but it's absolutely, just think about the physical buildings, right? One of those, they tend to be like really inefficient, and yet they're actually really prime for a low carbon transition. You can have an air source heat pump, and you dig down into those playing fields, which all schools have, and you can heat that building quite easily from renewable energy, right? That is something that should be done, around the world. And so I think there's really simple things about thinking about your own school. What is your school strategy to becoming a net zero? So you can really do that in your local community. But I think it's then just education. I think there's a real failure in macroeconomics in the way we think about our economies, that we focus on, you can say, narrow measures of GDP, that we talk about growth and maximizing growth, but we don't think about the consequences of that growth, what's happening to our natural environment, what's happening to carbon emissions. And I think young people and teachers really educating about how we bring those two worlds together is so important. And I think that's where we all have a duty to educate ourselves more about that and learn what is our own individual role, but what is our role as a wider society.
Lutfey, a lot of what Rain said made a lot of sense, actually. But how comes and how do we convince governments about this need to broaden curricular offerings in education, and to look at education delivery in a much more whole school kind of way, as opposed to just focusing on core skills in numeracy and literacy and that kind of thing? Do you have a view on that?
Sure. So firstly, I think Rain is absolutely right, and we should feel positive about the fact that on climate change, it's not a contested issue in the UK. And you just have to look across the Atlantic and see how much wastage of energy there is on this issue. So it's tremendous that there is a plan. You may disagree with the minutiae of it, but there is a green plan. There is almost a New Deal. So that provides us with hope. I think from any government's point of view, when they look at education, they would want to ask, what is it for? Education has to be a vector, not a scalar. Maybe you could have a small amount of that, which is about the love of learning for its own sake. But I think it needs to result in something. And this is either in a vocational sense. So further education colleges, right, in the UK, I think they need to be strengthened. Apprenticeships in the ecosystem of learnings need to also get its respect that it deserves. I look at examples of people who have successfully made transitions this year through the pandemic, and there's an example in one of those New York Times articles. Somebody learned instrumentation, electrical systems. It's a 3-month course, and they're able to now repair elevators, whether it's in a hospital or in a school or wherever, right? And some people have resistance to changing careers, but if you think about military people, there are very few nobler professions. They change professions as a matter of course. They hit their 40s and there's nothing else they can do in their first career, and they move on to something else. And I think there's something to be said about their mindset as to how they transition. But coming back to governments, I think we need to show them a line of sight to the economic recovery plan. If we are in a situation now where we cannot recover last December's GDP in the next 5 years, that's a dire, clear and present state to be in. And if educators are able to show that this is how we will equip people to be able to take us back there. And by the way, we have a double whammy of the sectors that are impacted by COVID also happen to be the sectors that will be impacted by Brexit in the near term. And part of the promise of Brexit is that you reconfigure the economy so that you're not reliant on the same sectors that you were, that were more EU leaning and so on. So I think you position and contextualize education in that immediate national agenda. And then education has to be one of the pillars, as Rain said, one of the enablers of the growth plan from here on.
Rain is going to hate you, Lutfey, because you've opened this Pandora's box of Brexit, and I have to ask her it now. In terms, what do you think the implications of the Brexit that we're going to experience soon is on things like the public sector in the UK?
Well, I mean, look, I think,
and I apologize for this, but I do have to ask now.
Thanks, Vikas. I think over the long term, what we know is changing our trading relationship for the UK with our major trading partner. Essentially economists will talk about, having a more closed economy can mean you are more closed to innovation, to ideas, to goods and services from around the world. So, if you're just faced with an either or choice, we know that over the longer term that will have an impact on our economy. But it really does depend what we do with it. And actually, a lot of that change has already happened in the UK. We've already seen business investment, which is where you see the main impact, has been really weak for about 4 years. So we've already seen some of that impact. And so I think for us, it's about, and hopefully we'll have a deal in the coming days. Once we have that deal in place, it's about, what can we do to make sure the UK stays open to the world, that we innovate, that we stay open to talent from around the world, because the world isn't static. So I think that's really, really important to bear in mind. And I think, look, COVID has put things in perspective. I do take issue where people sort of say, oh, well, Brexit will be more damaging to our economy than COVID. I think that's certainly not true. If we talk about what's happened to the UK economy this year, undoubtedly, COVID and the damage that we will see from that has been, has been huge. And Brexit, what we will see over the coming weeks will not compare with that sort of economic shock. But I think the other thing that's so important as well, I think, in terms of job security, right? The only thing I'd sort of add to the conversation, and I'd probably disagree with Lutfey on two things. First of all, I think our economy will bounce back quicker from the pandemic once we have a vaccine in place. than we expect. So actually, we think the economy as a whole will regain where it was by about the end of 2022. And I think different to the global financial crisis, we should see less. There weren't serious imbalances in the economy that then led to this crisis. This really was a health crisis. And so if we can get the right, policies in place to address that health crisis, then we should emerge. And I think once the world returns to normal, I think we will be surprised at how quickly, I don't think we've, in some sense, I think it's made us realize how important our connection with each other as human beings is even more important, right? And I think the only other thing I'd say to the teachers to bear in mind, and I know you've been at the forefront of so much of this, is one, I think, remember what's going on in your in the lives of the kids that you're teaching. So I think generally job security in the public sector has been strong, right? I don't think that's where we're going to see a loss in jobs. In fact, I think we'll see growth in public sector jobs overall, in care, social care, health, education, right? But I think a lot of households will be dealing with higher unemployment, and that insecurity and uncertainty is really hard to deal with. But finally, the biggest thing is that you can empower your kids with is resilience, right? Because the one thing I would say business leaders are most concerned about now, and I think actually where we might see lasting scars from the pandemic, is about mental health, right? I think I'm not really worried about the economy. We will recover from this. We absolutely have to tackle higher unemployment. What I am worried about is, it's the emotional scars that in some sense have had to be necessarily repressed during this time, because we've just been, like the British people do, keep calm and carry on, and we get through this crisis. But a lot of kids, a lot of adults will be bearing a lot of scars because they haven't been able to have the social outlets. And how we help rebuild people's mental health, their resilience, and so we can really come out of this pandemic stronger, I think that is going to be the thing we really have to tackle. And if there's one positive thing, I think it's led to much more honest conversations about mental health and how fragile we all are. And so I hope we carry that, forward into the rest of our lives.
You're right to say that one of the, when someone asks me what the silver linings that emerge from the pandemic in education are, I'd say to you that actually the placing of well-being at the heart of the conversation is one of those real, shining moments actually for me. And for those watching this, there's a great charity in the UK called Education Support that actually provides like a phone line, a helpline to teachers who need help with issues of coping and actually dealing with the pandemic. And so I congratulate them for what they have been doing. On that note, thank you so much for participating in this live stream, Lutfey and Rain. I look forward to perhaps engaging with you in the new year, and look forward to our future conversation as to how economics has played out and what teachers and schools need to know. So thank you so much for joining me from Singapore, Lutfey, and from Oxford, Ray. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And thanks to all the teachers out there. You're amazing.